All right, number 3 roster rankings, PFF.com. It's the Philadelphia Eagles. I agree. I'd have the Eagles in this range. I think I'd have them or the Chiefs, I think, competing for that third spot. What are your thoughts on the Eagles and their ranking here?
So I think this is still a good roster. I do, however, have many more questions about it than I have had in the last couple of years. Like the Eagles have been a team, I think, that have been in the sharp end of this roster ranking for a few years now. They have got a lot more question marks on the defensive side in particular. And this feels a little bit like the Bengals from a couple of years ago, where they've done a really good job of like future proofing and identifying, where they're going to lose players, where they're going to have to plug in new young players to pick up the slack, aging guys that have either already departed, guys like Fletcher Cox retiring, on the other side. So they've lost Jason Kelsey, who obviously got all the attention on the offensive side, but Fletcher Cox retired at the same time, right? So two of their sort of stalwarts in the trenches on either side of the ball have gone in the same offseason. Now's when they need, Jordan Davis or Jalen Carter to step up on that defensive side. But so far, a lot of the guys they've plugged in to be the continuity guy, the replacement, the successor, hasn't gone well, right? Like Nakobe Dean was supposed to be that a year ago, and injuries meant that we just didn't see it. The cornerbacks, now we might need Quinyon Mitchell to step in and be that guy right away. And similar to Detroit, he might be. I mean, he was consensus cornerback 1 or 2, whichever. If you went Arnold number 1, you had Mitchell number 2. If you went Mitchell number 1, it was usually Arnold number 2. So it might be fine or it might be a problem. I think, there's just more questions than there used to be.
We've got the secondary. What became a big. This is the challenge here with the Eagles. I guess they're toying with moving James Bradbury around and moving him out off of corner at this point in his career. The challenge I have is the collapse that they had last year. It's the same talent, right? Last year going into the season, the Eagles, we probably ranked them as the best roster, if I remember correctly, going into the year, at least 1 or 2. And they just absolutely collapsed last year. And they looked just disastrous on the defensive side of the ball. So again, let's go to this. How do you separate coaching and from the players? The players were the same team pretty much that went to the Super Bowl. Last year at this time we said, Cam Jurgens has to step in and start. It's right. Like, all right, if that's the only big question that you have, it's not bad. But all of a sudden they looked old in the secondary. They couldn't communicate. Guys were running free all over the place. There was in-house fighting but with the coaching staff. So if you could separate that a little bit, have they made the right moves? You're right. I mean, there's a little bit of do they actually have the right linebackers? I don't know. They're probably worse than they were a couple years ago. Are the young players going to be able to step up and take pressure off of Slay and Bradbury, who had been so good for that year and a half basically for the Eagles? So yeah, there are definitely some question marks there, but they have intriguing pieces to replace those guys, especially in the secondary with the first and second round pick, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. So love what the Eagles have done from a roster standpoint. It will be on Vic Fangio, Kellen Moore, both sides of the ball to just make everything better, because it did seem like the failure last year for Philly was the coaching, offensive and defensive. They didn't have answers for the blitz on offense. It looked like they couldn't even recognize a route combination in the second half of the season. Guys were running free. The linebackers looked old and slow and out of place, and they weren't even necessarily old and slow. They were just always out of place. So to me, that's the big question. But when you're just looking on paper, where do the Eagles stack up? Strong in the right spots, and as always, deep on the defensive line, and still one of the better rosters in the NFL.
Yeah, the only other issue for Philly is I think their depth isn't as strong as it used to be. Wide receiver, say you've got A.J. Brown, you've got Devontae Smith. Those are still both great. You've got one of the top wide receivers in the NFL. You got one of the top number 2 wide receivers in the NFL. But then with Devontae Parker retiring, like immediately you run out of proven commodities at wide receiver. If either one of those guys gets hurt, you've got potential issues. Now you're down to a couple of rookies coming in, Johnny Wilson or Aeneas Smith. Paris Campbell is on the roster as well. And then the offensive line as well. Now that we're going to have to reshuffle, replace Jason Kelsey, Cam Jurgens will step in and play there. But now immediately that offensive line no longer has the depth. The starting 5 should still be okay, even with one question mark at guard. But if an injury hits anywhere on that offensive line, you run out of the depth that they've had in previous years. So I think just across the board, as a product of this, like struggling to replace those starters, I think Philadelphia's roster depth isn't as good as it used to be.